I want to tell you about a door, not a dramatic door, not a door in a story about grand gestures and perfect timing. Just an elevator door in a hotel in Vienna on a Wednesday morning when I was running late for a briefing and not paying enough attention to who was walking toward me. I held it open. She walked through. She said nothing. I thought nothing of it. That was my first mistake. My name is Remy Ash, and in that small ordinary moment in a Vienna hotel elevator was the beginning of the most complicated and most real thing that has ever happened to me. Stay with me, because Distorsi starts with a door and ends with a choice. And the choice is the part that matters. I am a threat analyst. That is the clean way to say it. The full version is longer and less comfortable. I spent 6 years in military intelligence learning how to read rooms before anything went wrong in them. After that, I spent 4 years doing private security work for people who needed to think clearly when they were too frightened or too arrogant to do it themselves. I was good at the work because I had stopped having feelings about it, not permanently, just professionally. I had learned to turn down the volume on everything that was not information. The way a room smelled, the position of a person's hands, whether the person standing near the window had looked at the door more than twice in 3 minutes. I noticed everything and felt almost nothing, and I called this discipline. I was wrong about what to call it, but that discovery came later. The Vienna assignment arrived on a Monday. My handler at the firm, a man named Callum who communicated almost entirely in understatements and gray folders, called me at 7 in the morning and said I had a protection contract if I wanted it. I asked for the principal's name. He said I would receive it on arrival. I said that was not how protection work functioned. He said this contract did not follow standard protocol. I said whose protocol? He said the client's. The fee in the gray folder was large enough to make that answer temporarily acceptable. I flew to Vienna that evening. The hotel was the kind that did not advertise itself. No logo above the door. No concierge in a uniform that was trying too hard. Just a building on a quiet street that knew what it was and did not feel the need to explain it to anyone who had not already been told. I arrived at 8 in the morning after a night flight and no sleep, and the particular hollow focus that comes from running on professionalism and very bad airplane coffee. The briefing room was on the 4th floor. I was late because I had spent 6 minutes in the lobby doing what I always did when I entered a new location. Exits, cameras, staff positions, reflective surfaces. The man near the window who had looked at the door twice in 90 seconds. I was almost at the elevator when it opened. A woman stepped out. She was perhaps 40, perhaps older, dark coat, dark hair pulled back. The kind of face that had been trained over many years to reveal nothing it had not decided to reveal. She moved through the lobby the way certain people moved through spaces they had already mapped and judged and found wanting. Behind her, two men at a careful distance, too well dressed to be staff, too still to be guests. She was 3 steps from the elevator when it began to close. I put my hand in the gap. The door opened again. She turned her head. She looked at me the way I looked at rooms, like I was information she was filing. She did not say thank you, she said. You have been standing in this lobby for 6 minutes and 20 seconds. Her accent was German first, something else underneath. The something else felt like it had made decisions, I said. The window near the east entrance has been checked twice by a man in a blue jacket in the last 3 minutes. She looked at the window, looked back at me. She said, yes. He is mine, I said. He checks exits before threats. He should check both at the same time. Something in her expression moved. Not much, just enough. She stepped back into the elevator. She said, come. I said, I have a briefing on the 4th floor. She said, so do I. The elevator closed. She looked straight ahead. I looked straight ahead. We did not speak. On the 4th floor, she walked past the briefing room, opened the door at the end of the corridor without a key, and sat down at the head of the table as if the room had been expecting her since it was built. Callum was already there. He looked at me. He looked at her. He said, I see you have already met, she said. Ms. Ash held an elevator door for me. Callum said, efficiently, I hope. She looked at him with an expression that ended the joke before it fully arrived. Then she looked at me. She said, "My name is Isolde Kren." I had heard that name in rooms where it was spoken carefully, not loudly, never loudly. Kren family holdings across 7 European countries. Shipping, logistics, real estate, private banking. The kind of business empire that looked completely legitimate until you knew which questions to ask and in which order. Then it looked like something older and less polite than legitimate. Isolde Kren was not a high-value client. Isolde Kren was a weather system with legal representation. She said, "You have heard of me." I said, "Enough," she said. "Does enough worry you?" I said. "I don't worry. I prepare," Callum coughed. Isolde looked at him. He stopped coughing. She said to me, "I require threat assessment and close protection for 14 days. External to my existing detail. Someone who has not already been sold," I said. "What makes you think I have not?" she said. "You noticed my man at the window before I introduced you to the situation. You used that information as an opening, not an accusation. And you held an elevator door for a woman you did not know was important," I said. "The last one is not a qualification," she said. "It is the only one that matters." I said nothing. She said, "Do you want the contract or not?" I said. "I want to know the threat first," she said. "Someone inside my organization has been selling access. 4 meetings in the last 2 months were expected before they were announced. A shipment was delayed by an inspection that knew exactly what to inspect. A family contact in Frankfurt is missing." I said, "Do you know who?" She said, "I have 3 suspects and no proof," I said. "Then you need the proof before you can fix the leak," she said. "Yes." "Which means I cannot trust my current detail completely. I need someone outside the system who can watch the system from outside," I said. "And if I find out it is someone you trust." She looked at me with the full weight of those gray eyes. She said, "Then I trust you to tell me the truth." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in a year of work. I signed the contract. The first days with Isolde Kren were an education in what power looked like when it had stopped needing to perform. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten directly. She did not waste movement or words. She made decisions the way good architects designed buildings, with the end state in mind from the beginning. She also did not make protection easy. She changed her route to a meeting without warning. She sent decoy cars. She accepted appointments with people who had not given their full names. She disappeared from my sightline for 11 minutes on the second afternoon, and reappeared in a coffee shop 4 blocks from the hotel without explanation. I found her in 8 minutes because I had already mapped every coffee shop within 6 blocks. She was seated near the window, watching the street. A man across from her was sweating despite the cold. I came in through the kitchen, spoke to no one, and stood near the only exit the man could reach. Isolde did not look at me. The man left without finishing his coffee. On the walk back to the hotel, she said, 8 minutes. I said, "I could do 7 with better information," she said. "Alon would have apologized for losing me." I said, "I am not apologizing for choices you make." She said, "Even if those choices put me at risk." I said, "Especially then. My job is not to pretend you are someone who does what she is told." She glanced at me. She said, "Then what is your job?" I said, "To build around the fact that you are not." She walked 3 more steps. In silence, she said, "I have had 17 protection details in 12 years. None of them said that." I said, "What did they say?" She said, "They said they would keep me safe." I said, "I cannot promise to keep you safe." "I can promise to be more prepared than whoever is coming," she said. "That is a very uncomfortable thing to promise." I said, "Yes, but it is an honest one." She did not respond, but her walk changed slightly after that. Something loosened, almost invisible. "But I noticed because I noticed everything. If you are still here, I need to tell you something. Working close protection is mostly watching. You watch the room, you watch the exits, you watch the people who are watching the principal, you watch the principal herself, which is where it gets complicated. Because Isolde Kren was someone who was watching everything at the same time. She watched the people in meetings the way I watched rooms. She cataloged, she filed. She found the thing no one knew they were showing, and she used it when she needed it, and she watched me. I noticed that on day 3. She noticed things about me the way I notice things about threats, my coffee habits. The fact that I positioned myself near exits, even in restaurants that were obviously safe. The way I never sat with my back to a door. The old stiffness in my right shoulder that I managed carefully because injuries were private information. She noticed without commenting. That was the more unsettling part. Most people who notice things use them. Isolde Kren collected them and put them somewhere I could not see. I was starting to understand that this was the most dangerous thing about her. Not the power. Not the empire or the missing contact in Frankfurt or the leak inside her organization. In fact, she saw Pisachal clearly, including me. Keep listening, because this is where the threat stops being theoretical. The dinner where it became real was on the 6th day. A private room in a Vienna restaurant. 8 people around a table. Old money and new arrangements, and the particular tension of people who had done business together long enough to have something on each other. Isolde wore a deep blue dress that did not try to be noticed and was impossible to miss. I stood near the wall. A man named Dritter kept looking at Isolde's hands. Not her face, her hands. I had seen that kind of looking before. Men revealed themselves by what they were afraid of. Isolde handsies were still on the table. Completely still. The kind of still that was a choice. Dreher made a comment about her father's old roots being difficult to maintain without his specific relationships. He said this pleasantly. He meant it as a knife. Isolde said, "My father's relationships were his. Mine are current." A laugh moved around the table, nervous and thin. Dreher smiled. Under the table, his right foot shifted back slightly. Not aggression yet. Preparation. A body deciding before a brain catches up. I was already moving. The young man on Dreher's left had been sweating since the appetizers. His jacket pulled wrong on the right side. A concealed weapon, badly placed. When his hand moved toward his jacket, I was at his shoulder. I pressed 2 fingers into the correct point and said quietly, "No." His hand opened. Something clattered. Every head turned. Dreher's face went dark red. Isolde looked at the young man, then at me, then at Dreher. She said, "I hope that was an accident," he said. "My apologies." "My associate is nervous in formal settings," she said. "Tell him formal settings are safer for everyone if everyone keeps their hands visible." The dinner ended early. In the car afterward, Isolde sat beside me instead of across from me. The city moved past the windows, she said. "You saw him before he moved," I said. "He was watching Dreher for permission. He reached before he got it," she said, "which means," I said, "someone else paid him, not to succeed, to make tonight difficult." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Alan would have been watching Dreher," I said. "I watch the people powerful people think they control." She said, "How did you learn that?" I said, "Experience." She said, "What kind?" I said, "The kind that costs something." She did not ask what it cost. She just looked out the window and said, "Useful lesson." I said, "It came late." She said, "Most useful lessons do." We did not speak again until the Haratel. But something had changed in the distance between us. Not collapsed, just adjusted. Like a measurement that had been taken twice and found more accurate the second time in Sule. The attack came on the 9th night. A meeting on a private boat on the river. 2 contacts and a lawyer whose presence meant either he was genuinely there for documentation or he was being used as bait. I hated the boat immediately. Too many blind angles. Water on all sides, I told Isolde. She said, "I know." "That is why I am going," I said. "Knowing a trap and walking into it on purpose are different things." She said, "I need them to believe I do not know." I said, "Tell me the rest." She did. The leak inside her organization had been narrowed to 2 people. The meeting on the boat would tell her which one. If the meeting was interrupted by something unexpected, the guilty party would have been the one who knew about it in advance. I said, "You are using yourself as bait," she said. "I am using the situation." I said, "Those are the same thing," she said. "I trust you to make sure the bait survives." That was the second time she had said something that landed harder than professional language should. On the boat, I watched the crew. Not the contacts, not the lawyer, the crew. One deckhand kept moving to the same position near the railing. His jacket weighed wrong. His shoes were new in the way that people wore new shoes when they were not used to wearing that kind of shoe. I saw the earpiece when he turned his head. I said down. Isolde heard my voice and moved without hesitation. The shot that came through the window above her was close enough to be a statement. We moved fast through noise and smoke and the particular chaos of confined space under fire. Isolde was calm in a way that told me she had been in rooms like this before, even if not on water. She did not freeze. She did not perform fear. She found cover and held it and waited for direction. I gave direction. We got off the boat through a side ladder into cold water and a waiting car that I had positioned there without filing the location with anyone. In the car, she was shaking slightly, not from fear. From the particular cold of river water in October and the chemical aftermath of real danger, I said. Are you hurt? She said. No, you, I said. I am fine, she said. You have blood on your collar. I checked. She right. I said superficial, she said. You say that word like it means nothing hurts, I said. It means it will stop. She looked at me for a moment with those gray measuring eyes. She said, Where are we going? I said. Somewhere not already known, she said. Callum's protocol, I said. Callum's protocol goes through channels I no longer trust. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, drive. Are you still with me? Good. Because this next part is the part I did not expect. The part where two people who had been keeping careful distance end up in a farmhouse in the Austrian countryside, and the distance gets harder to maintain. This is where it gets honest. Stay. The safe house was a stone farmhouse 2 hours from Vienna, a contact of mine from earlier work. No phones connected to the firm. No location in any file Callum could access. I cleared the rooms while Isolde waited in the kitchen with the calm of a woman who had decided to trust. A decision she had not made herself. There were 2 bedrooms, a pantry, a fireplace that worked, a first aid kit under the sink. I came back to find her standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark fields. She had removed her coat. Her hair was slightly loose from the wet. She said, The leak. I said, Tell me. She told me the 2 people it had been narrowed to. The meeting on the boat was supposed to confirm which one. The attack had confirmed both, not one of them. Both, working together. She said it without drama, just the fact. I said, How long? She said, I think 4 months, maybe 5. I said, People you trusted. She said, One of them I trained myself. I taught her how to read a room. The kitchen was quiet. I said, Sit down. She said, I am fine. I said, You have been fine through a shooting and a boat escape and a river in October. Sit down. She looked at me. She sat. I found the first aid kit and cleaned the cut on my collar line while she watched. She said, Let me. I said, I have done this before. She said, I can see that. She came around the table and took the kit out of my hands. Her fingers were steadier than mine at that moment, which was information I filed in the category of things I would examine later when I had the room for honesty. She worked quietly, carefully, the way she did everything. When she finished, she did not step back immediately. She said, You left the protocol behind for me. I said, I left it for the mission, she said. You say that and you do not believe it, I said. I believe it enough, she said. That is not the same as believing it. The farmhouse was very quiet, wind outside. The faint sound of the fireplace beginning to catch, I said. Why did you get into the elevator? She paused. I said, You could have let the door close. You did not need to go back in. You had already passed through. She looked at the bandage she had just finished. She said, I noticed you in the lobby before you noticed me, I said. I was scanning, she said. I know, that is why I noticed you. Most people scan and look through the room. You scan and look at it. Like the room is real, like the people in it are information worth having. She looked up. She said, I went back into the elevator because I wanted to know what someone like that would say. I said, Someone like what? She said, Someone who looked at the world like it mattered. The farmhouse was very quiet. I said, I should make something to eat. She said, Yes, I made pasta. Simple. The kind you make when a pantry has limited options and two people need something to do with their hands that is not looking at each other. She sat at the table and watched, and did not pretend to be looking anywhere else. We ate in the particular silence of people who have run out of professional excuses. After a while, she said, "Tell me something that is not about the assignment," I said. "What kind of something?" She said, "The kind you would not put in a report." I looked at my plate. I said, "I almost did not take this contract." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because when Callum would not give me your name, I understood the contract was unusual. Unusual contracts usually mean the client has something to hide from the people she is hiring." She said, "And now?" I said, "Now I understand what you were hiding from, not what you were hiding." She said, "There is a difference," I said. "A large one." She turned her wine glass slowly. She said, "I learned to run this organization at 22. My mother died when I was 20. My father 3 years before that. The people around me were older and more experienced and completely willing to help me fail so they could step into the space." I said, "But you did not fail." She said, "I made examples. I learned who could be trusted, and I built walls everywhere else." After a while, the walls became the architecture. I stopped being able to tell where the wall ended and the room began, I said. "And the people who knew you before?" She said, "There were not many." I said, "Are there any?" She looked at the window. She said, "My assistant has worked with me for 11 years. She knows my coffee order and my worst decisions, and the name of the school I wanted to attend when I was 17. I said, "What school?" She said, "Architecture, in Zurich." I had the application half finished when my father became sick. I said, "You wanted to design buildings." She said, "I wanted to design things that were honest." My father used to say that buildings could not lie because gravity eventually exposed every mistake. I liked that idea. She looked at me. She said, "I ended up in a different kind of architecture." I said, "One where the mistakes are harder to see." She said, "And more expensive when they surface." We stayed at the table until the fire was mostly ash. Not because there was more to say. Because neither of us was ready to say what was actually there. Callum called in the morning. I took it outside in the cold November air. He said, "Where is the client?" I said, "Secure." He said, "That is not a location." I said, "Correct." He said, "You have deviated significantly from protocol." I said, "The protocol was compromised." He said, "You cannot know that." I said, "I know the attack happened. I know the timing. I know the information required to execute it came from somewhere inside the operation. I am not returning her to channels I cannot verify," he said. "You are not authorized for independent decisions at this level." I said, "I made them anyway." A pause. He said, "The firm is reviewing your contract status." I said, "Review it." He said, "Remy." I said, "If she dies because I followed protocol through a leak I could see, I will spend the rest of my professional life explaining why I trusted a system over a threat. I am not doing that." I ended the call. Isolde was standing in the farmhouse doorway. She had heard enough, she said. "They will terminate the contract," I said. "Probably," she said, and then I said, "And then I finish the job because the job is not finished." She looked at me in the pale morning light. She said, "You are very difficult to understand." I said, "Most people find me simple," she said. "Most people are not paying enough attention." She went back inside. I stood in the cold for another minute. The fields were frost-covered and still. A crow moved across the far tree line. Somewhere far away a tractor engine started. The world was very ordinary and very present. I went back inside. The second night at the farmhouse changed the distance. Not all at once. Gradually. The way cold changes when a fire has been burning long enough. We had been working through the information. Isolde's contacts. The two who had been selling access. The infrastructure they had used. The damage that could be repaired and the damage that could not. At some point, we stopped working and started talking. She asked me about the work before the firm. I told her some of it. A source I had trusted who had trusted a superior who had not deserved it. A 20-year-old woman in a city I cannot name who had believed we could get her out faster than we did. The particular way that failure lives in a body. Isolde listened. Not with sympathy exactly, with attention. The way she gave her attention to everything that she decided deserved it. She did not comfort me with words that would have been smaller than the thing they tried to cover. She said, "What did you do with it?" I said. "I left. And then I did this work, and I told myself I was doing it well enough to make up for it." She said, "Did it work?" I said, "For a while. Less now." She said, "Why less now?" I said, "Because I have spent tonight talking to someone who does not let me hide behind professionalism, and it is becoming harder to remember why I started hiding there." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have not let anyone this close in a long time," I said. "I know," she said. "How?" I said, "Because you keep almost stopping yourself. There is a fraction of a second before you say something real, where you decide whether to say it or the safe version. Tonight, the real version keeps winning." She looked at me. She said, "That is very uncomfortable to have noticed." I said, "Yes, I imagine it is." She said, "Remy," my name in her voice, "different from the professional version, different from the command version, just my name," she said. "I am going to say something," I said. She said, "It notices things. It is how I have survived. I notice what people want and what they fear and where they are soft, and I use that information. That is who I am, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." I said, "I know," she said. "But the things I have been noticing about you, I have not been filing in the useful place." I said, "Where have you been filing them?" She said, "Somewhere I did not have a name for until tonight. The farmhouse fire was low. The windows showed black fields and a sky with too many stars for a city person to be entirely comfortable with." I said, "He's old." She said, "Yes." I said, "I am not going to make this easier for you," she said. "I know," I said. "I will not pretend I do not see what your life is," she said. "I would not ask you to," I said, "and I will not become someone who stops telling you the truth because the truth is inconvenient," she said. "I know." It is the reason I got back into the elevator. We looked at each other across the farmhouse table. Outside, the frost was deep on the fields. Inside, the fire needed attention. She stood up to put more wood on it, and I watched the firelight move across her face, and I understood that I had crossed a threshold without deciding to. Not the elevator, not the boat, not even tonight. At the hotel lobby, when I put my hand in the gap of a closing door because a woman was walking toward it and I did not know she was important and it did not matter. That was when I went to help her with the fire. Our hands were close over the logs. She turned. I said, "Yes." She said, "I did not ask." I said, "You were about to." She kissed me. Not the way people kissed in movies with the music swelling and the light arranged correctly. The way two people kissed when they had both spent too long being careful, and the carefulness had finally cost more than the risk. Quiet. Certain. With the full weight of everything we knew about each other underneath it. When we stopped, she was looking at me in the firelight. She said, "The contract will be terminated." I said, "I know." She said, "That changes your position here." I said, "I know." She said, "You would be staying because you chose to." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not because you were paid." I said, "Not because I was paid," she said. "That is more frightening," I said. "Yes, it is." She looked at the fire. She said, "I have not been chosen for something in a very long time." "Not by someone who knew what they were choosing," I said. "I know what I am choosing." She said, "Do you?" I said, "I am choosing someone who has done things I cannot endorse and survived things I cannot imagine and carries all of it with a precision that is either the strongest thing I have ever seen or the loneliest." Her breath was quiet. I said, "Probably both." She said, "Probably both," I said, "and I am choosing her anyway." With my eyes open, she turned from the fire. She looked at me for a long time. She said, "That might be the most dangerous thing anyone has ever said to me." I said, "I know, but I said it anyway." The morning after came with consequences. Callum's message arrived at 6. Contract terminated effective immediately. Failure to follow protocol. Compromised judgment. No longer representing the firm. I read it in the farmhouse kitchen while coffee made itself. Isolde came in and read my face. She said, "When?" I said, 6 this morning. She said, "I am sorry." I said, "I made the call." She said, "You made it for me." I said, "I made it because it was correct." She said, "Remy." I said, "Those are not always different things." She was quiet. Then she said, "I need to return to Vienna." The two who sold access need to be addressed. There are channels that need to be secured. People who need to see that the structure held. I said, yes. She said, it will not be clean work. I said, I know. She said, and after it is done. I said, tell me what after looks like. She looked at the coffee. She said, I have a house in the south, not connected to the business, not on any map that matters to the people who would use it against me. Olive trees, a view of the water. A library that has never had a meeting in it, I said. That sounds like the architecture school, she said, perhaps. I said, what happens there? She said, I have never invited anyone. The farmhouse was very quiet. I said, ask me. She said, I am asking. I said, then yes. She picked up her coffee. She said, you should know it is not safe to love me. I said, I know. She said, you should know I am not good at it yet. I said, neither am I. She said, we will make mistakes. I said, yes. And we will say them out loud when we do. Both of us. She said, you make it sound manageable. I said, I make it sound honest. Manageable is different. She almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile I had seen from her that was not controlled. I filed it in a place that was not professional. I was getting better at that. The return to Vienna was efficient and terrible and necessary. I will not describe the details because they are hers and not mine to give. What I will tell you is this. She handled it the way she handled everything, with precision, with the exact amount of force required, without enjoying it. And afterward, she sat in the car and looked out the window at Vienna in the rain and said nothing for 20 minutes. I sat beside her and said nothing, too, because there was nothing that would have been worth saying. Sometimes presence is the only honest thing available. After 20 minutes, she said, thank you. I said, for what? She said, for not making it mean something else. I said, it means what it is. That is enough. She looked at me. She said, how did you know that was what I needed? I said, I noticed. She said, what? I said, that you hold things very precisely when you are deciding how much weight they get, and that you needed to give this one its exact weight without someone adding to it. She looked at me for a long time. She said, I was right about the elevator. I said, what about it? She said, about going back in. I was right to. I said, yes. She said, you would have held the door for anyone. I said, yes. She said, that is why I went back. I did not answer because the answer did not need words. She took my hand, in the car, in the rain, in Vienna. She took my hand and held it with the precision she brought to everything that mattered. And I held it back. The house in the south was real, olive trees, a view of the sea, a library with no meetings in it. We went there 3 months after Vienna. She showed me the rooms without explaining them. The kitchen where she had learned to cook, when she was 12, from a housekeeper who had no patience for people who would not learn. The terrace, where the morning light came from the right direction. The study with the architecture books she had kept since she was 17. I sat in the library and she stood in the doorway and watched me the way she watched everything. I said, you look nervous, she said. I do not get nervous. I said, you look like someone who has never let anyone into a room that matters before, and is waiting to find out if it was a mistake. She was quiet, I said. It was not a mistake. She came into the room. She sat across from me. She said, I need to tell you something. I said, tell me. She said, this is the only place I have not had to be Isolde Kren. I said, what do you mean? She said, everywhere else I am a name. A structure. A decision made 3 moves ahead. Here I am only the person who reads on Tuesday mornings and burns the coffee and cannot choose paint. Colors without 2 weeks of consideration. I said, that sounds like you. She said, it sounds like a person, not a function. I said, yes. She said, I want to be a person here, I said. You are a person everywhere, she said. You know what I mean, I said. I know what you mean. I looked at her across the library. She had her shoes off. Her hair was down for only the second time I had seen it. She was reading the spine of a book she had already read, because her hand knew where it was. She looked like someone who had built a very large and very heavy thing over 20 years, and had finally found a place to set it down for an afternoon. I said, I am not going to let you only be a person here. She looked at me. I said, I am not saying the rest of it is not real. The structure, the decisions, the things you carry. I know they are real. I am going to stand beside you in all of them. But I am also going to make you eat dinner when you forget, and tell you when you are being unfair and ask how you slept and mean it. She said. That sounds like a great deal of work, I said. It sounds like a life. She looked at the window. She looked at me. She said, I have not known how to want a life that was mine. Everything I built was functional. Every room served a purpose. I said, what does this room serve? She said, nothing. I said, yes, it does. She said, what? I said, this is the room where you are, Isolde. Not the function, just the person. She looked at the architecture books. She said, I still think about buildings sometimes. What it would have been like to design them, I said. You designed a different kind. She said, I know. Not the honest kind. I said, they can still be honest. It depends who is in them. She looked at me for a long time. She said, you are the only person who says things like that and makes me believe them. I said, I know. She said, that is very inconvenient. I said, I know that too. She smiled, the full version, not controlled, not measured. Not the fraction of a smile she deployed when professional warmth was required, the real one. I understood then why she kept it contained. It changed everything in the room. It made her look younger and more certain, and like the girl with the architecture application, and the woman with the empire and the person reading in a library on a Tuesday's morning all at once. I said, you should do that more. She said, what? I said that. She said, I am out of practice. I said, I noticed. We can work on it. She said, are you always going to be insufferable? I said, I am going to be honest. Those are sometimes the same thing. She picked up her book. She said, sit here then, if you are staying. I moved to the chair beside her. She read, I read. The library was quiet and warm, and outside the olive trees moved in the sea wind, and somewhere in the distance the water was doing what water did, and none of it required anything of us for the next several hours. That was the beginning of the part neither of us had known how to ask for. Here is what I know now. I held an elevator door for a woman I did not know was important. She turned out to be the most complicated and the most real person I had ever been. Given the chance to understand, she has done 10 things I cannot endorse. She carries an empire built on decisions I do not always agree with. There are rooms in her life I cannot enter, and choices she makes that I have to trust her with. Not because I am naive, but because trust is not the same as agreement. We fight. We are both too precise about the wrong things at the wrong moments. She goes quiet when she should speak, and I speak when I should be quiet, and we have learned to say that was then, and this is now, and give each other room. The organization. I work independently now. Threat assessment, security consulting, lines I draw and maintain. She tells me when she crosses into darkness, not because I ask, because she decided that honesty was the only architecture she wanted in the rooms we shared. I tell her when I disagree, she argues. Sometimes she changes something, sometimes she does not. Both of us know the difference between changing your mind and being managed. The library in the South is still there. She reads on Tuesday mornings. I make coffee badly, and she drinks it without commenting, which I suspect is the closest she comes to sentimentality. Last week I found her standing in front of a wall she has been looking at for months. She said, I want to change this wall. I said, what kind of change? She said, I do not know. I have been thinking about it for 3 months and I cannot decide. I said, that sounds like you are thinking about it like a structure and not like a room. She looked at the wall, she said. What is the difference? I said. A structure has to hold something. A room just has to be somewhere you can breathe. She was quiet. Then she said, I want it to have light. I said, that is a start. She said, I want it to feel like the architecture books I never finished reading. I said, honest. She said, yes. I said, then make it honest. She looked at me. She said, you make things sound simple. I said, I make them sound possible. That is different. She went back to looking at the wall. She said, I will need your opinion. I said, you will get it whether you ask for it or not. She said, yes. That is why I am asking. I stood beside her, and we both looked at the wall, and the morning light came through the window at the angle that made. Everything in that house looked like something that had been worth the distance it took to reach it. That was enough. That has always been enough. Every door has two sides. Which one I am on. I know it every morning. Still yes, still here, still choosing.